Harriet Conley had loved a man who left her for something better, and the worst part was not that he had gone. The worst part was that on the morning he saddled his horse and rode out of Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882. He had looked back at her standing on the porch of their little clapboard house with her dark hair loose around her shoulders, and he had not even had the decency to appear sorry about it. His name was Thomas Wren, and he had told her 2 nights before that departure that a man of his particular ambitions could not afford to spend his best years rooted in a town barely wide enough to cast a shadow. He said it with his chest puffed out and his eyes already somewhere else, somewhere past her, past the low, rolling hills of the Cherokee Strip, past everything she had believed they were building together. She had stood in their kitchen with her hands still dusty from kneading bread dough, and she had listened to him dismantle 3 years of her life in the time it took the lamp wick to burn down another 1/4 inch. She was 26 years old when Thomas left, and the town of Caldwell held its breath around her in the way small towns always do when a woman is abandoned, not with malice, exactly, but with a particular species of pity that felt worse than cruelty. Women whispered behind their gloved hands at the dry goods store. Men averted their eyes at church, as though her bad luck were a contagion. Her landlord, a wide-bellied man named Prout, began appearing at her door on the 1st of each month with an expression that suggested he expected her to fail at meeting the rent. She did not fail. That was the first thing to understand about Harriet Conley. She was 5 feet and 4 inches of red brick stubbornness with green eyes that could cut glass when she was angry, and she refused, with a ferocity that surprised even herself, to become the cautionary tale that Caldwell seemed determined to make of her. She took in sewing. She baked pies and sold them to the hotel kitchen. She taught 2 of the merchant family's daughters their letters 3 afternoons a week in exchange for a small wage and a basket of vegetables every Friday. She kept the house. She kept herself. And slowly, painfully, like a person learning to walk again after a long illness, she began to think that perhaps life without Thomas Wren had more room in it than life with him had ever allowed. It was a cool October morning, with the plains grass gone to gold, and the sky the particular shade of blue that only Kansas seemed to produce, deep and absolute and without apology, when Calvin Bailey rode into Caldwell for the first time. He came from the south, down the cattle trail, trailing a small remuda of horses he was bringing up from a ranch outside of Wichita to sell at the livestock auction that Caldwell held every 3rd Saturday of the month. He was 29 years old, lean through the hips and broad through the shoulders, with sun-darkened skin and dark brown hair that curled slightly at the back of his neck where it had grown a little too long. He had a straight, honest face, the kind of face that did not bother with pretension because it had never needed to, and brown eyes that were quiet and observant in the manner of a man who had spent a great many years alone with wide open spaces and had learned to pay attention to things. He had been a cowhand since he was 16, working various cattle outfits across Texas, Oklahoma Territory, and Kansas. He was not a famous man. He was not a wealthy man. He owned a good saddle, a reliable mare named Duchess, a Colt revolver he hoped never to use on anything that walked on 2 legs, and a small parcel of land south of Caldwell, 40 acres along a creek, that he had purchased 8 months earlier with the intention of eventually running his own small horse operation. The land was good. The creek ran clear. The intention had not yet resolved itself into anything more concrete than intention, because Calvin Bailey, for all his quiet competence, had been carrying a persistent and low-grade uncertainty about whether he was the kind of man who could make something that lasted. He did not know Harriet Conley when he rode into town that October morning. He did not know her name or her situation or the particular shape her grief had taken in the months since Thomas Wren had ridden out of her life. What he knew, stopping at the water trough at the end of Main Street to let his horses drink, was that he was hungry and tired, and that the smell coming from the hotel kitchen was extraordinary. He tied Duchess to the rail and walked into the hotel dining room, which served meals to the public for a modest fee. He sat at a table near the window, ordered coffee and whatever was hot, and the waitress, a young woman named Clara who talked constantly and cheerfully about everything, brought him a plate of roast chicken with potatoes and a thick wedge of apple pie that he did not order, but that appeared alongside the plate with Clara's explanation that it was included on Saturdays. Which was not technically true, but which Clara had decided to make true because she liked the look of him and thought he seemed like a man who needed feeding. The pie was exceptional. "Who made this?" Calvin asked, genuinely startled by the quality of it. "Harriet Conley," Clara said, refilling his coffee with the practiced ease of a person who understood that information and coffee were equally valuable currencies. "She supplies the hotel with baked goods. That woman can do things with an apple and a crust that ought to be considered a form of artistry." "She work here?" Calvin asked. "No, she has her own arrangement with Mrs. Fenton, who runs the kitchen. Harriet does the baking at home and delivers it mornings. She also does sewing if you need anything mended. She is over on Elm Street, the blue-shuttered house." He did not immediately go to Elm Street. That was not his way to rush at things. He sold his horses at the auction the following day, got a fair price for all but one of the roans who had a temper issue that depressed his value, arranged a small amount of credit at the hardware store, and spent 2 nights at the boarding house of Mrs. Aldridge, who was 70 and small, and served enormous breakfasts and asked no questions, which suited him perfectly. It was on his second evening in Caldwell, walking back from the livery stable where Duchess was boarded, that he first saw Harriet Conley in person. She was coming out of the dry goods store with a basket over one arm and a bolt of calico fabric balanced against her other shoulder, managing both with the competent air of a woman who had long since stopped waiting for help that was not coming. The bolt was slipping. Calvin was close enough to reach out and steady it before it fell, which he did, without thinking, the way you catch a thing that is falling before your mind has finished debating whether to catch it. She stopped and looked at him with those green eyes that he would later describe, privately, as the kind of eyes that make you feel immediately and thoroughly evaluated. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was lower than he expected, measured and clear. "Happy to help," he said, and then because he was not a man who invented conversation easily, he said nothing else, which she seemed to appreciate, because she nodded with something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one, adjusted the bolt against her shoulder and walked on. He stood there for a moment longer than was entirely sensible, watching her go. It was 3 days before he had a reason to approach her again, and the reason was entirely legitimate and entirely manufactured simultaneously. His good wool coat had torn along the right shoulder seam during the horse auction when one of the roans had made a desperate bid for freedom and dragged Calvin through a fence rail, and the tear was significant enough to warrant mending. He could have left it. He had left worse. But he walked to the blue-shuttered house on Elm Street on a Wednesday afternoon, with the coat folded over his arm, and knocked on the door. Harriet opened it and looked at him and then at the coat, and something in her expression shifted into professional assessment. "The woman at the hotel mentioned you do mending," Calvin said. "I do," she said. "Come in and let me look at what you have." The inside of the house was small and extremely clean, with good curtains and a work table near the window that held a collection of spools and needles and scissors arranged with the kind of careful order that spoke of a person who had decided that if they could control nothing else, they would control their immediate environment. There were dried flowers on the windowsill and a shelf of books along one wall, more books than he would have expected in a house this size in a town this size, and a wood stove burning steadily in the corner. She examined the shoulder seam with the coat spread across her work table, turning it in the light, running her thumb along the torn edge. "This will take about 20 minutes if you want to wait," she said, "or I can have it ready tomorrow morning." "I can wait, if that is not an inconvenience," he said. She gestured at the chair near the stove with a motion that was not unfriendly but was also not particularly warm, which he respected. He sat. She began to work. They did not speak for the first several minutes. Outside, the wind was picking up from the northwest in the way it did in October on the Kansas plains, carrying the first serious chill of the coming winter. The stove popped and settled. Her needle moved through the fabric with small, precise strokes. "You were at the livestock auction Saturday," she said eventually, not looking up from the coat. "I was," he said. "I brought horses up from a ranch near Wichita to sell." "You are not from Caldwell." "No, but I have land south of here, along the creek." She looked up at that briefly. "The Alderman parcel. I bought it from Alderman's son last winter. It was listed through the land office." "It is good land," she said. "The creek does not run dry in summer. A lot of the creeks around here dry up by August." "That was one of the reasons I chose it," he said. She went back to her work. Another stretch of silence, but it was a different quality of silence than before, easier, the kind that does not require filling. "You are planning to run horses?" she asked. "That is the plan," he said. "Building toward it. I still take work where I can get it for now." "How long have you been working cattle?" "Since I was 16. She glanced up again. "That is a long time." 13 years, he agreed. "Long enough to know that someone else's cattle are not something I want to spend the rest of my life tending." There was a small pause, and then she said, without particular emphasis, "It is a reasonable ambition." And he felt, in the way she said it, simply, without condescension or excessive encouragement, that she was a person who meant what she said and did not say things she did not mean. And he found that quality so immediately and profoundly appealing that he had to look at the floor for a moment. She finished the seam, ran her thumb along it, held the coat up to the light to examine her work, and then folded it and handed it to him with a price that was extremely fair. He paid her, thanked her, and went back to his boarding house, where he lay on his narrow bed staring at the ceiling for a good while, thinking about green eyes and dried flowers on a windowsill, and the way she had said, "It is a reasonable ambition," as though the reasonableness of a thing was sufficient justification for pursuing it. He did not leave Caldwell the next day as he had planned. He told himself this was because he had a few more things to attend to in town, some harness hardware he needed to source, a conversation with a rancher named Gideon Porter, who had expressed interest in buying horses directly from him in the spring. These were real things. They were also, he was honest enough to admit to himself, convenient things. He saw Harriet 3 more times that week, twice by circumstance, and once by a contrivance so mild he barely counted it as contrivance. He happened to be walking along the main street when she was delivering her pies to the hotel kitchen, and he offered to carry the basket, which she accepted after a moment's consideration that was so brief it might have been imperceptible to anyone who was not paying attention. But Calvin was paying attention. They walked together the half-block to the hotel's side entrance, and she told him about the apple varieties she had found most reliable for pie at this elevation and in this climate. And he listened to her talk about apples with the genuine interest of a man who is actually fascinated by the way another person thinks rather than by apples specifically. He asked if he could call on her that Sunday afternoon. She was quiet for long enough that he began to prepare a graceful retreat, and then she said, "Sunday afternoon would be fine," in a tone that was careful but not cold, the tone of a person who has been hurt badly enough to be cautious, but not yet badly enough to be closed. He went back to his land on Saturday to check on things. The creek was running well. The fence along the north boundary needed work. The small lean-to he had built in the spring was holding up against the weather, and he spent that night in his bedroll under the open sky with the stars scattered across the Kansas dark above him, thinking about what he was doing and whether he had any right to be doing it. He had no illusions about himself. He was a man of modest means and large intentions, who had thus far managed to acquire land and ambition in roughly equal measure, without having proved whether the ambition could be converted into anything that would justify asking a woman to share his life. He had courted one woman before, briefly, 4 years ago in Texas, and it had ended without drama and without particular sorrow on either side, which perhaps said something about how little either of them had truly wanted it. This felt different in a way he could not fully articulate and did not try to. On Sunday afternoon, he arrived at the blue-shuttered house at 2 o'clock with a small bundle of late-season wildflowers he had gathered along the creek. Nothing elaborate, just some goldenrod and purple aster that were still holding on despite the cold, and knocked on the door. She opened it and looked at the flowers for a moment, and something in her face went very briefly unguarded before she composed it again. She thanked him, put the flowers in a jar of water, and they sat in her parlor with coffee she had made and a plate of small ginger biscuits and talked for 2 hours. She told him about growing up in Missouri, about coming to Kansas at 22 with her family, about her parents who had both died within a year of each other from fever when she was 24. She told him about learning to sew from her mother and about the books. She had loved books since she was 8 and could manage 3 or 4 a week when she had time, which was not often. She told him about Caldwell, its particular character, its cattle trade history, the way the town had changed since the Cherokee Strip land run of 1889 was in discussion, and the whole region was full of a restless energy about what might come. She did not tell him about Thomas Wren. He did not ask. It was not the right time, and he was not a man who pushed at things before they were ready to be pushed. He told her about Texas and the years of cattle work, and the landscape he loved out here on the southern plains, which was not beautiful in the way that mountains were beautiful, but which had its own kind of grandeur that most people missed if they were not paying attention. He told her about the land along the creek and what he wanted to build there. He told her about Duchess, who was 11 years old and had been with him since he was 20, and whom he regarded with a loyalty that he was slightly embarrassed about but that he felt nonetheless. She laughed at that, the first real laugh he had heard from her, a sudden bright sound that she seemed slightly surprised by herself. "You do not need to be embarrassed about it," she said. "Loyalty is not something to be ashamed of, even when it is directed at a horse." He walked home in the October dusk with the feeling of a man who has been given something valuable without entirely understanding yet what it is or what he should do with it. He called on her the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that. By the third Sunday they had moved from the stiff formality of their first conversation to something looser and warmer, the kind of conversation that takes wide-ranging, unpredictable turns, that doubles back on itself and strikes out in new directions, that feels less like a performance of interest and more like actual interest. She was funny in a dry, understated way that crept up on you. She was opinionated about things, about books, about the right way to winter-proof a root cellar, about the question of women's suffrage, which she held views on that were clear and not shy, and which Calvin found himself agreeing with more than he would have expected, not because he was trying to agree, but because she made her case with a precision that was difficult to argue with. He was falling in love with her, and he knew it, and he did not panic about it the way he might have expected to, because it did not feel like falling so much as it felt like arriving. It was on the 4th Sunday visit that she finally told him about Thomas Wren. She told it plainly, without self-pity and without bitterness, though both must have been in there somewhere, buried deep beneath that red-brick stubbornness. She told him that she had been with a man who had decided that their life together was not sufficient to his ambitions, that he had called it something better, as though she were a thing to be traded against a better offer, as though 3 years of shared life could be measured against opportunity and come up wanting. "I am not telling you this to be pitied," she said, looking directly at him across the table. "I am telling you because it seems like the kind of thing a person ought to know, and because I have found that the things we do not say tend to sit between people and take up space." Calvin looked at her for a long moment, his coffee cup between his hands, the afternoon light coming through the curtains and laying long golden strips across the table between them. "Did he find it?" Calvin asked. "Whatever was better." Harriet's chin lifted slightly. "I have no idea. I stopped keeping account of Thomas Wren the morning he rode out." "Good," Calvin said, very quietly. And then, because he was not a man who made speeches but who occasionally said a single true thing with enough weight behind it to stand on its own, he said, "I want you to know that what you have here, what you have made here, in this house, in this life is not nothing. It is a considerable something, and any man who could not see that was not looking at what was actually in front of him." Harriet Conley, who had not cried about Thomas Wren in months, because she had decided months ago that he was not worth the salt, felt the back of her throat tighten in a way that had nothing to do with grief, and everything to do with the particular devastation of being genuinely seen by another person after a long time of being invisible. She blinked once, cleared her throat, and said, "That is a kind thing to say," which was not at all what she meant but was all she trusted herself with in that moment. Calvin nodded and said nothing else, and they both looked out the window at the last of the afternoon sun on the brown grass of the street, and the silence between them was warm in a way that silence had not been between Harriet Conley and any other person for a very long time. The weeks continued. November came in gray and cold, and the first real snow fell on a Thursday afternoon in mid-month, blanketing the prairie in white that made the world look both clean and impossibly lonely, depending on where you were standing when you looked at it. Calvin was in town more than strictly necessary. He had taken a short-term job helping Gideon Porter with some fence work on Porter's spread east of town. It paid reasonably, and let him stay close without it looking like he was staying close, which mattered to him, because he did not want Harriet to feel pressed. She had been pressed before by a man whose needs and wants had overridden her own, and he was constitutionally opposed to being that variety of man. He saw her on Wednesdays when he helped carry her baking delivery to the hotel, which had become a habit they had both stopped pretending was accidental, and on Sundays, and sometimes on Friday evenings if she happened to be at the library. Caldwell had a small lending library run out of the back room of the newspaper office, about 300 books, which Harriet regarded as a treasure, and which she visited with the regularity of a devout person visiting church. He started borrowing books from the library himself, which he had not done in years. She gave him recommendations, and he read them, and they talked about what he had read, and she was interested in his opinions in a way that made him want to have better opinions, to read more carefully, to think more precisely about things. One Friday evening in late November, walking back from the library through the snow with their breath making small clouds in the cold air, she stopped in front of the blue-shuttered house and turned to face him, and he had the sense that something was about to happen, that the particular quality of the moment required it. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to be honest with me." "All right," he said. "What is it exactly that you are doing here, Calvin? In Caldwell, I mean. Because your land is south of here and your business is mostly conducted through the auction and through contacts you have established, and you are spending a great deal of time in this town, and I want to understand whether that is because of me, or whether I am constructing a situation that does not exist." He looked at her. The snow was falling lightly, catching in her dark hair, and the lamp from the boarding house down the street laid a warm gold stripe along the street between them. "It is because of you," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "What are your intentions?" She said, and she said it in the way a serious person asks a serious question, directly, without coyness, without the expectation that the question itself would be found too forward. "My intentions," he said, "are to earn your trust if you will permit it, to spend time in your company if you will have it, and eventually, if it seems right to both of us, to ask you something more significant." "You are talking about marriage," she said. "I am talking about the direction of marriage, yes," he said. "Though I understand that is a large thing to say to a person you have known for 7 weeks, and I am not asking it now. I am only being honest about the general shape of what I hope for." Another pause, longer this time, the snow falling soft and steady in the dark around them. "I appreciate the honesty," she finally said, "and I will be honest with you in return. I'm not willing to be left again. I'm not willing to be someone's second best or their temporary arrangement or their stepping stone toward something better. If that is too much to say too early, I understand, but I would rather say it than not." "It is not too much," he said. "And I am not asking you to be any of those things. I am asking you to give me time to show you what I am asking you to be, which is the kind of person I spend the rest of my life being grateful to." Harriet Conley stood in the November snow on Elm Street in Caldwell, Kansas, and felt something shift inside her chest, something that had been locked tight against the possibility of this kind of moment, shifting with the slow, reluctant movement of a door that has been closed a long time beginning to open. "Sunday," she said. "Come Sunday." "I will come Sunday," he said. She went inside. He stood on the street for a moment in the snow, and then he walked back to his boarding house with his hands in his coat pockets and the feeling of a man who has been given an extraordinary gift and is trying very hard to be worthy of it. December came, and with it the full weight of a Kansas winter. The temperature dropped sharply in the first week, and the prairie lay under a hard gray sky that gave light without warmth, the frozen grass crackling underfoot, the creek on Calvin's land running slow and glassy with cold. He spent most of December working. He took 2 more short-term jobs, one helping a rancher named Mac Creddy move cattle to winter pasture, another doing carpentry work for a man who was building a new livery stable on the north end of Caldwell. The carpentry work was useful because it let him practice skills he would need when he eventually built proper structures on his own land, and because it kept him in town. Every Sunday he went to Harriet's house. Every Sunday the conversation went deeper, covered more ground, revealed more of who they both were. He learned that she had opinions about politics that she kept carefully muted in public, because she had learned that opinions from a woman were received differently than the same opinions from a man, and she had calculated that public discretion cost her less than public argument. He found this calculation infuriating on her behalf, and said so quietly, and she looked at him with an expression that was part surprise and part something softer. She learned that he had a younger sister in Texas named Ruth who was married to a schoolteacher and had 2 small children, and that he sent Ruth a portion of his earnings every 3 months because their father had died when Calvin was 22, and he had assumed the role of provider out of something that was less obligation than love. She learned that he had a temper that ran deep and slow and cool, not the hot flaring kind that expressed itself in raised voices, but the deep, quiet kind that came out only when he believed something genuinely unjust was happening, and that, when it came out, was more formidable for its quietness. She told him things she had not told anyone in Caldwell about her mother's hands, how her mother had the most capable hands she had ever seen, how she had tried to have her mother's hands and had partly succeeded, about the books she had loved as a child, about the loneliness that was not about Thomas Wren specifically, but about the more general condition of being a woman alone in a world that consistently made that condition difficult, a loneliness that she had mostly made her peace with, but that sometimes at night sat on her chest like a stone. He listened to all of it. He did not try to fix it or minimize it or redirect it towards something more comfortable. He listened the way the land listens, receiving everything, holding it steady. On Christmas Day, which was a Tuesday that year, she invited him to dinner. She cooked a proper meal: roast chicken, biscuits, sweet potatoes, 2 kinds of pie. He brought a bottle of very decent wine that had taken considerable effort to source in Caldwell, which did not exactly overflow with vineyards, and a small package wrapped in brown paper. She opened the package at the table after dinner. Inside was a book, a copy of George Eliot's Middlemarch, which he had tracked down through a bookseller in Wichita at some logistical trouble because she had mentioned once in passing that she had been trying to find a copy for 2 years. She held it for a long moment, her thumbs on the cover. "This is," she started and then stopped. "You mentioned it," he said simply. "I know I mentioned it," she said. "I mentioned it once, 3 weeks ago." "I pay attention," he said. She set the book down and looked at him across the clear dinner table in the warm light of the lamp, and what was in her face was not gratitude, or not only gratitude. It was something more complex than that, the expression of a person whose internal architecture is rearranging itself around a new understanding. "Calvin," she said. "Yes," he said. "I think I am in the process of falling in love with you," she said, with the directness of a person who has decided that honesty is the only approach she can afford. "And I want you to know that. And I want you to know that it frightens me considerably." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, not dramatically, not with a great sweeping gesture, but with the steady, deliberate care of a man placing something valuable where he intends it to stay. "It frightens me too," he said. "That seems right to me. A thing that does not frighten you at all is probably not a thing worth having." She turned her hand over under his so their palms were together, and they sat like that in the lamplight on Christmas evening, while the wind pressed against the windows and the Kansas winter kept the world outside cold and dark, and entirely outside their concern. January brought the kind of cold that stopped conversation in the street and made the short distances between buildings feel like expeditions. The cattle pens at the edge of town were empty and silent, the auction suspended until spring, and Caldwell contracted into itself the way small towns do in hard winters, drawing in, becoming concentrated, every person more visible to every other person in a town that was already entirely visible. This visibility was not, in all cases, comfortable for Harriet Conley. The situation with Calvin had progressed to the point where it was observable. He had Sunday dinners at her house regularly now. He accompanied her on her Wednesday morning delivery. He had fixed the loose gate on her back fence one Saturday afternoon, and been seen doing it by 3 separate neighbors who all had opinions about what this signified. Mrs. Aldridge, at whose boarding house Calvin still lived, had told Clara at the hotel, who had told approximately everyone, that Calvin Bailey was clearly serious about Harriet Conley, and the town had divided itself into those who thought this was a fine thing, and those who thought Harriet ought to be more careful, and a smaller group who thought the whole business was scandalous, though they were not entirely clear on what the scandal was. Harriet had largely learned to ignore all of this, but there were moments when the weight of other people's opinions settled on her like weather, and one such moment came in the middle of January when she encountered a woman named Martha Pruitt outside the dry goods store. Martha was in her 50s, the wife of one of Caldwell's more established merchants, and she had known Thomas Wren and had apparently taken his departure as a data point in a larger theory she had constructed about Harriet's prospects. "I hope you are being sensible," Martha said, which was her way of saying she hoped Harriet was being considerably less than sensible and was prepared to discuss it. "A man like that, a cowhand with a piece of land and good intentions, is all very well, but you are not 20 anymore, Harriet, and—" "I am 27, Harriet said pleasantly, "which is not yet ancient, and I appreciate your concern, Mrs. Pruitt, but I am quite capable of managing my own affairs." "I only mean—" "I know what you mean," Harriet said, with a smile that was so controlled it could have been a weapon. "Good morning." She told Calvin about it that Sunday, and he listened with the particular quality of stillness he had when something made him genuinely angry. "Are you bothered by it?" he asked. "I am bothered by the implication that my judgment cannot be trusted," she said. "I am not bothered by Martha Pruitt's opinion of me, which I have never sought and do not require." He looked at her with an expression she had come to recognize as his version of admiration, which was quieter than most people's admiration but went considerably deeper. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want to say it clearly so there is no ambiguity." "All right," she said. "I am not going anywhere," he said. "I want to be clear about that. Not for something better, not for something different, not for any reason that I can currently imagine or that I am capable of imagining. I am here and I intend to continue being here. And if that is something you can trust, then I would like you to trust it. And if it is something that needs to be demonstrated over more time than we have had, I will take that time. Harriet sat with this for a moment. It is something that needs to be demonstrated, she said, honestly. I believe you mean what you say, but meaning and doing are different things, and I have learned that the distance between them can be larger than a person anticipates. Then I will demonstrate it, he said. That is all I am saying, that I will demonstrate it. All right, she said, and then very softly, I know you are not him, Calvin. I know that every day more. February arrived brutal and beautiful, the plains scoured flat and white under skies of absolute pewter. Calvin made regular trips out to his land to check on things. The linta had held. The creek was frozen but intact. The fencing was largely undamaged. He had begun in the evenings at his boarding house, drawing out rough plans for a proper house. Not elaborate 2 rooms to start, with the intention of adding, but solid, with good thick walls and a substantial chimney, the kind of construction that was meant to last. He showed the drawings to Harriet one Sunday afternoon, spreading them across her work table, uncertain of what he was asking exactly, but certain that he was asking something. She looked at them with the focused attention she brought to all things, her head slightly tilted, her finger tracing the lines of the proposed layout. You have not planned a room for sewing, she said, without looking up. The statement landed between them with a very particular weight. He had, in fact, planned a room he had labeled in his own notes as the back room, which he had not specified because he was not sure what he was allowed to specify yet. But the implication of what she had said, the way she had said it as a practical observation, as though she were already in the house, already arranging its rooms to the necessities of her life, made his heart do something inconvenient and large. I can adjust the plan, he said carefully. She finally looked up at him, and her green eyes were direct and unguarded and certain, which was a combination he had come to understand was rare for her and was the most valuable thing she had to offer. I think, she said, that if you are planning a house on land you own along a creek south of Caldwell, and if you are showing that plan to me, you might be doing so because you have something to ask me. I might be, he said. Then ask it, she said. I would rather you ask it plainly than have it hover between us for another month. Calvin Bailey, who had practiced this in his head exactly once because he was not the kind of man to over-rehearse a thing, set down his pencil and looked at Harriet Conley across her work table in the February light and said, Will you marry me? I am asking plainly. I am asking because I love you and because I believe that we could build something real and lasting together, and because I intend to spend the rest of my life making certain you never have cause to doubt that I am exactly where I want to be. Will you marry me? She was quiet for exactly 4 seconds, he counted, without meaning to. Yes, she said. I will. He came around the table. She met him halfway. And for the first time, there was nothing careful about either of them. They held each other in the February light of her small parlor with all the force of 2 people who have arrived somewhere after a long and difficult journey and are absolutely certain they are not leaving. They were married on the 15th of March, 1883, in the small Methodist church on the corner of Oak and First Street in Caldwell. The ceremony was simple and genuine, performed by Reverend Aldous Cole, who had a kind face and a way of conducting weddings that made them feel like they were about the actual people in front of him rather than an abstract institution. Clara from the hotel came and cried, which surprised everyone including Clara. Gideon Porter attended with his wife and shook Calvin's hand with both of his own, which was Porter's highest form of endorsement. Mrs. Aldridge sat in the front pew in her Sunday best and looked extremely satisfied with herself, as though this marriage were partly her doing, which she perhaps felt it was. Harriet wore a dress she had made herself, deep blue wool with cream buttons, simple and beautifully cut, the kind of dress that was made to look elegant through the precision of its construction rather than the elaborateness of its decoration. Calvin wore his best coat, the one she had mended on the day they met, which he had thought about when he put it on that morning, and which he had decided was appropriate. She walked toward him down the aisle of that small church, and he watched her come, and his face was the face of a man who has been given everything he has ever wanted and knows it fully, and is not afraid to know it. They stood together before the Reverend and made their promises, and when they were made in the manner of people who understand the weight of promises and have no intention of treating them lightly. The spring that followed the wedding was the finest spring Calvin Bailey had ever experienced, which he understood might be partly attributable to meteorological factors and largely attributable to other things. They moved to the land south of town, not immediately into a proper house, which was not yet built, but into a larger structure that Calvin and Gideon Porter, who had appointed himself unofficial advisor to the whole enterprise, put together in the weeks following the wedding with the practical efficiency of men who understood that necessity was a compelling architect. The structure was warm and dry and considerably more comfortable than it looked from the outside, which was true of several things in Harriet Conley Bailey's life, she reflected. She arranged it with the same focused precision she had brought to the small house on Elm Street, and within 2 weeks it felt unmistakably and completely like home. She brought her books, of course. They lined 2 full shelves that Calvin built for her against the east wall, which she had designated the reading wall, and he had built them to her specifications, which meant they were exactly the right height and depth, and were sanded to a smoothness that no splinter could survive. She put the dried flowers on the windowsill out of habit, and then realized she could have fresh ones now, real ones, growing from the ground she lived on, and she made a mental note to plant a proper garden in the spring. Calvin worked the land with the methodical devotion of a man who loves what he is doing. He acquired 3 mares in April good stock, with solid lines, and 1 stallion whose temperament was sound enough to be trusted, and whose quality was high enough to justify his cost. He built the first proper horse paddock from timber he sourced from a mill in Wichita, and he and Harriet worked on the fencing together on the good days, she holding posts while he drove them, both of them working in the comfortable silence of people who have stopped needing to fill every moment with sound. The house itself was begun in May. Calvin hired 2 men from town, a carpenter named Whitmore and his apprentice, and between the 4 of them, the house went up through May and June and was substantially complete by the 1st of July. 2 good rooms, with space roughed in for a 3rd, a real chimney, a covered porch on the south side looking out over the creek, and a room in the back with north-facing windows that had excellent light all day and which Harriet immediately established as her sewing room. On the evening they moved the last of their things into the finished house. They stood on the south porch as the sun went down over the prairie in its extraordinary Kansas way, the whole sky going from blue to gold to pink to the deep bruised purple that preceded the stars, and the creek below caught the light and held it, and the land around them was entirely theirs, or as much as land can be anyone's. "What do you think?" Calvin asked. Harriet stood at the porch rail with her hands flat on the wood, looking out at the view that was now her view, at the creek and the grass and the big open sky. "I think," she said, "that this is better than anything I ever thought I was going to have." He came to stand beside her, his shoulder against hers, and they watched the last of the light leave the sky and the stars begin to appear one by one in the warm summer dark. "I have thought about something," she said after a while. "Tell me," he said. "Thomas said he was leaving for something better," she said. "And I spent a long time asking myself what he meant by that, what better looked like to him, whether he found it. And I think now that the thing I could not have understood then, which I understand now, is that better was always a direction for him, not a destination. He was always going to be heading toward something rather than being somewhere, because the being somewhere was not something he was capable of." She turned to look at him, and his face was close and serious in the dusk. "You are somewhere," she said simply. "You are here, and you intend to be here, and I understand now that that is what I always needed and never quite had. And I want you to know that I know the difference." Calvin Bailey looked at his wife in the last of the summer evening light on the porch of the house they had built together on the land he had chosen because the creek ran clear, and he felt the full weight of everything she had just given him. Not the words exactly, but the trust beneath the words, the trust that had been withheld for so long and which was now being offered absolutely. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they stayed there on the porch while the stars came out in their thousands above the Kansas prairie, and the creek ran quietly below them, and nothing was left unresolved or wanting. The summer of 1883 unfolded over the land south of Caldwell with a generosity that felt, in its own wordless way, like endorsement. The horses Calvin had acquired in April produced their first foal in June, a bay colt with a white star on his forehead that Harriet named Asterisk, which Calvin initially resisted, and then accepted when he noticed that the name was, in fact, appropriate to the marking. The foal was spirited and healthy, and represented the first product of the operation Calvin had been building toward for nearly 2 years, and he stood at the fence watching Asterisk move around the paddock in the long summer evening, with the satisfaction of a man seeing a theory proven. Harriet's garden established itself with the same focused determination she brought to everything. She had planted it in late April vegetables primarily, with a border of flowers that she had justified to herself as practical because flowers attracted pollinators. And by July, it was productive enough that she had more than they needed and began trading the surplus with neighbors. There were not many neighbors close, the homesteads being spread at intervals across the plain, but there was a family named Harker 3 miles east, a man and his wife and their 4 children, and a single woman named Dolores Vega a mile south who was Mexican-American, who had homesteaded the land alone 2 years earlier, and who was regarded by the other settlers in the area with various degrees of suspicion that Harriet found both predictable and infuriating. It was Harriet who first rode over to Dolores Vega's property with a basket of tomatoes and squash and introduced herself, because it seemed to Harriet that the most efficient response to a neighbor being treated poorly was to be a good neighbor oneself, and because she recognized in Dolores' situation, a woman alone, making something from nothing, regarded with skepticism, something she understood from a different angle. Dolores Vega was 32 years old, small and dark-eyed and extremely capable, with a directness that Harriet liked immediately. She had been in Kansas for 4 years, had worked her land with intelligence and resourcefulness, and had developed, through necessity, a comprehensive philosophy about ignoring opinions she had not invited. She and Harriet became friends with a speed that surprised both of them, 2 women who had each decided that the landscape of their lives would be determined by their own efforts rather than by what anyone else had decided was possible for them. Calvin liked Dolores as well when Harriet brought him to meet her. He admired her land management, said so directly, and asked her specific questions about her water arrangements, because she had solved a drainage problem on her property that he was still working out on his own. And she told him what she had done with the precision of a person who had figured something out through trial and error, and was not precious about sharing the knowledge. They became the kind of neighbors who helped each other with large tasks and left each other alone the rest of the time, which was the ideal proportion. In August, Harriet knew she was pregnant. She told Calvin on a Sunday morning, sitting at the table with their coffee, as though she were telling him something practical and important, which it was. He sat very still for a moment, and then his face did something that she would remember for the rest of her life. It simply opened, all the careful composed layers of it, and what was underneath was joy of a kind that was entirely unguarded and unperformed. "Are you?" he started. "I am well," she said. "I am completely well." He got up from the table and came around and put his arms around her from behind, and she put her hands over his where they rested against her, and neither of them said anything for a long while, because there was nothing that needed saying. The pregnancy progressed through the fall and early winter with what the doctor in Caldwell, a competent, matter-of-fact man named Dr. Hatch, called a straightforward course. Harriet was strong, and the baby was developing well, by every indication Dr. Hatch could bring to bear. She continued her baking delivery to the hotel through October, accepting Calvin's company on the Wednesday trips without argument, which was itself a form of argument in reverse. She allowed the help because she had decided that there was a difference between needing help and accepting it, and that accepting it from a person who offered it because they loved you was not a diminishment. She also continued her sewing work through the fall. She had, over the course of the year, expanded the operation somewhat, taking in more complex commissions, making garments for families who needed good quality work at fair prices, developing a small reputation in Caldwell and the surrounding area as someone whose work was reliable and whose prices were honest. She had, in the privacy of her own accounting, come to understand that her sewing work contributed a meaningful portion of their household income, which pleased her in a way that she discussed openly with Calvin, and which he was entirely enthusiastic about, because he was the kind of man who understood that a capable person's capabilities did not diminish in any direction when they married. The baby came on the 23rd of February, 1884. It was a long night. Dr. Hatch came out from Caldwell. Dolores Vega came from her property and proved indispensable in ways that Dr. Hatch acknowledged honestly, and Calvin spent several hours on the porch in the February cold, because Dolores had pointed him firmly in that direction, and informed him that his presence in the room was not going to help anyone, and that he should make himself useful by staying out of the way. He walked the porch and looked at the frozen creek and the clear winter sky, and thought about every contingency in turn, and then decided this was not a useful activity, and tried instead to think about the spring, and what needed to be done, and could not think about the spring either because his entire consciousness was occupied by the sounds from inside the house and the careful silence between those sounds. And then, around 3 in the morning, there was a sound of a different kind, entirely high and declarative and absolutely certain of itself, and Dolores appeared at the door and said, with the calm of a woman who has attended several births on her own property among her own people, "You have a son, and both of them are perfectly well." Calvin walked through the door and into the back room, which had been rearranged from its normal sewing room configuration, and saw Harriet lying in the bed with the most exhausted and complete expression he had ever seen on a human face, and in her arms a small bundled person who was dark-haired and extremely opinionated about the cold air, and he sat on the edge of the bed and put his hand very gently on the top of his son's head. And Harriet looked at him and he looked at her, and there were no words that were adequate to the moment, so they did not try any. They named the boy Henry after Harriet's father. Henry Bailey proved, in his first weeks and months, to be a person of considerable personality, alert and opinionated and deeply uninterested in sleeping at times that were convenient for anyone else, and intensely interested in everything that moved or made sound. He had Calvin's dark brown eyes and Harriet's determined chin, and an expression of focused evaluation that made Dolores Vega, when she visited, laugh every time she looked at him. Calvin adored his son with a thoroughness that he had not previously understood himself to be capable of. He was the kind of father who was present, not ceremonially present in the way of a man who delegates the practical work of parenting while maintaining an official interest, but actually, physically, practically present. Walking Henry at 3 in the morning, sitting with him in the long afternoons while Harriet sewed, carrying him out to the paddock to see the horses with a regularity that suggested Calvin intended to begin Henry's equine education at the earliest possible age, which was extremely early. The spring of 1884 brought new foals and new business. Calvin had established, through the previous year's work, and the contacts he had built over many years in the cattle and horse business, a small but reliable operation, selling trained horses to ranchers and to the army buyers who came through Caldwell periodically looking for stock for the cavalry remount program. The army contracts paid well, and he had enough regular customers by spring that he hired a young man named Eli who was 17 and had been doing odd jobs around town, and who turned out to have a natural gift with horses that Calvin recognized and valued. He paid Eli fairly, which Eli apparently found unusual enough to mention, and which Calvin found remarkable that Eli found unusual, and they reached an arrangement that was satisfactory to both of them, and that lasted. Harriet's sewing work had grown to the point where she was considering, with the seriousness she brought to all considerations, whether it could be formalized into a more substantial enterprise. She had a conversation with Calvin about it on an April evening on the south porch while Henry slept inside and the prairie around them was greening up from the winter brown. "I want to take a commercial space in town," she said. "A small one. Just a room where I can meet clients properly and keep my supplies organized and take on the kind of commission work that I cannot manage at the house now that we have Henry." "Then do it," he said. She looked at him. "It will cost money to set up." "We have money," he said. "It is yours as much as mine. Use it." She had known, intellectually, that he felt this way, that he had never regarded their finances as his to allocate and hers to request. But knowing a thing, and having it stated plainly, without hesitation, without the subtle inventory of cost and benefit that Thomas Wren had always conducted before agreeing to anything, were different experiences. "You understand that this matters to me," she said, "not just for the income, for what it is." "I understand that perfectly," he said. "It is your work and you are good at it and you should have a proper place for it. I cannot think of a single reason not to do it." She rented a small space on Main Street in May, one room on the ground floor of a building, owned by a patient man named Harland, who did not care what she put in the room so long as the rent was paid, which it was, on the first of every month, with a punctuality that Harriet maintained as a point of personal principle. She set it up with the same careful precision she brought to all her spaces: a proper work table, storage for fabrics and supplies, 2 chairs for client consultations, her tools arranged with the efficiency of a person who has spent years working in smaller spaces and knows exactly where everything must be. She put a small sign on the door: H. Bailey, Fine Sewing and Alterations. The name felt solid in a way she had not anticipated and sat with all day after she hung it. The business grew. Caldwell was a town that needed quality work and often could not find it, and word of Harriet's skill spread in the way that genuinely good work spreads, organically, and through the testimony of satisfied people. By the end of her first year in the commercial space, she had more business than she could comfortably manage, and had hired a young woman named Sarah who was 19 and competent, and who Harriet trained with the same thoroughness and patience she would have wanted someone to use with her. The years moved through the middle of the 1880s with the particular momentum of a life that is being actively lived. The horse operation south of Caldwell grew steadily, earning a reputation for quality stock and reliable dealings. Henry Bailey grew from an infant of impressive personality into a small boy of even more impressive personality, confident and curious, and extremely attached to both his parents in ways that expressed themselves differently according to the person, which was Harriet, who he went to when he was hurt or frightened, and Calvin, who he went to when he wanted to learn something, a division that they both recognized as not quite accurate to their respective characters, but that they were too amused by to correct. In the summer of 1886, Harriet was pregnant again. This time she told Calvin in the garden, on a warm June evening, looking up from where she was staking tomato plants with the expression of a woman delivering information she considers significant. He had been working the fence line and came over dusty and sun-warm and listened to what she said, and this time the joy on his face was more immediate, needing less time to work through the layers, because he had already learned what this kind of news meant and how it felt. "How are you feeling?" He asked which was the first thing he said. "Well," she said, "better than last time at this stage, actually." He took the garden stake from her hand and finished staking the tomato plant himself, which she allowed with the equanimity of a woman who has learned the distinction between accepting help and being helpless. The second child was a daughter, born in February of 1887, whom they named Clara after the woman from the hotel who had first told Calvin about Harriet's pie, and who cried so hard and with such genuine joy at the news of her namesake that Harriet decided the honor was entirely appropriate. Clara Bailey came into the world at a considerably more moderate hour than her brother had in the early afternoon, with the February sun actually showing itself for once, and was from her first moments a different variety of person than Henry, quieter in her expressions, watching everything with enormous dark eyes, taking her time about things. Henry, who was 3 years old and had developed firm opinions about the organization of his universe, accepted his sister after a period of assessment that lasted approximately 4 days, after which he appointed himself her primary protector and explainer of things, which was a role he performed with such earnestness that even Harriet, who was not easily reduced to tears by sentiment, sometimes had to look away. Calvin Bailey watched his family with a wonder that was entirely private and entirely constant. He was a man who expressed himself more in action than in speech, but there were moments, and they came with enough frequency to be counted, to be remembered, when he looked at the life he was living and felt it so completely that something in him that had been braced against the world for a very long time went entirely quiet. One such moment came on a Saturday morning in the spring of 1887, when Henry was 3 and Clara was 2 months, and Harriet was at her work-table in the sewing room with Clara sleeping in the small crib nearby, and Calvin was on the south porch with Henry perched on the porch rail in front of him, both of them watching a red-tailed hawk work the thermals above the creek. The hawk moved in long, lazy circles, tilting on the wind, and Henry watched it with total absorption and said, without taking his eyes off the bird, "Papa, how does it know where to go?" And Calvin, thinking about it seriously the way he took Henry's question seriously, said, "I think it feels the wind under it, and it knows which way the wind is moving and it goes that way." Henry considered this. "Does it ever go the wrong way?" "Probably sometimes," Calvin said, "but then it corrects and goes the right way." Henry nodded with the gravity of a 3-year-old who is filing important information for future use. And Calvin looked out at the creek and the greening grass and the broad Kansas sky, and felt the quiet come down through him like a hand laid gently on his shoulder. He had looked, in his years of moving from outfit to outfit across Texas and Oklahoma and Kansas. He had looked at the various shapes a life could take, the various trajectories available to a man of his particular situation and capabilities. He had looked, and what he had found was that there was nothing, no opportunity, no possibility, no imagined version of a better or different life, that compared in any way to this porch, this creek, this child watching this hawk, and the woman inside the house whom he loved with a depth and specificity that he would not have known how to describe except to say that it was the most real thing he had ever encountered. He had found nothing better, because he had looked, and nothing better existed. There was a morning, it was late spring of 1887, the prairie in full green bloom, when Harriet was coming out of her shop on Main Street and encountered a man she did not immediately recognize, and then did recognize, and the recognition moved through her like cold water. Thomas Wren. He had aged in 5 years, filled out through the face, his hair touched with early gray at the temples. He was well dressed in the manner of a man who has done well enough by commercial standards, and he was with a woman, a younger woman, pleasant-looking and clearly uncomfortable, who seemed to sense immediately that something significant was happening in the moment her companion stopped short on the Caldwell sidewalk. "Harriet," Thomas said. His voice was the same. "Thomas," she said. She was absolutely calm. She noted this about herself with a kind of interior interest. 5 years ago this moment would have undone her, and it did not undo her now. "You look well," he said, and the words were inadequate in the way that all such words are inadequate. "I am very well," she said. He glanced at the sign above the shop door, H. Bailey, Fine Sewing and Alterations, and back at her. "You remarried." "I did." A pause of some duration, during which the woman with Thomas looked between them with an expression that was attempting and failing to decode what was being communicated beneath the surface of what was being said. "Are you settled here still?" he asked. "I am," she said. "We are. My husband and I have land south of town and 2 children and more than enough to keep us occupied." She said it without calculation, without the intention of landing a blow, but she watched his face as she said it and saw something move through his expression that she recognized as the specific variety of regret that comes not from grief over what you lost, but from the understanding that you gave away something whose full value you did not understand until too late. "I am glad for you," he said, and she believed he meant it, which was perhaps the most honest thing he had ever said to her. "Thank you," she said. She looked at the woman beside him with a direct, uncomplicated kindness. "I hope you are both well." And then she went back into her shop and closed the door behind her, and stood for a moment in the good light of the room she had built, with the smell of good fabric and the sound of the street outside, and she thought, "I am exactly where I am supposed to be." She told Calvin that evening, sitting on the south porch after the children were asleep, her voice matter-of-fact, her hands still in her lap. He listened without speaking until she was finished. "How did it feel?" he asked. "Smaller than I expected," she said. "He looked, I do not know." "He looked like a man who has gotten a great many things he wanted and is not entirely certain that wanting them was as definitive as he believed it was." Calvin nodded slowly. "And you?" she asked. "How does it feel hearing it?" He thought about it honestly. "Nothing worth troubling you about," he said finally. "He is a man who left a door open and walked through it, and on the other side of it was you, so I cannot find it in me to be anything but grateful." She looked at him for a long time in the evening light, her green eyes steady and warm. "Calvin Bailey," she said. "Yes," he said. "I love you exceedingly," she said. It was the most direct she had ever been about the depth of it, and the simplicity of it made it devastating in the best way. He reached across and took her hand, and they sat in the spring evening while the creek ran below, and the stars prepared themselves above, and the doors of that particular history closed quietly and completely and without drama, the way doors close when they are supposed to be closed. The years continued to be good to them, in the way that years are good to people who do honest work and love each other well. The horse operation grew into something that Calvin was now comfortable calling successful. He had a string of reliable contracts, a barn large enough to properly shelter 12 horses through the winter, and a reputation across the southern Kansas region for both the quality of his stock and the integrity of his dealing. He had hired Eli full-time and paid him a wage sufficient to live on with some left over, which Eli had apparently told half the young men in Caldwell about, because Calvin had since received 4 separate inquiries about employment from young men, with varying degrees of experience and enthusiasm. Harriet's shop had expanded to take in the adjacent room when it became available, and she had 2 women working with her now, Sarah, who had been with her from the beginning and whose skill had developed to the point where Harriet trusted her with the most complex work, and a newer hire named Josephine, who was 20 years old and methodical and reliable. The shop did good business, and Harriet ran it with the same combination of fairness, precision, and absolute refusal to cut corners that had characterized her work from the beginning. She and Calvin had also, in the years since Henry's birth, become quietly and consistently useful to the community in ways that were not ceremonial but were real. When the Harker family's barn burned in the spring of 1885, Calvin had organized the rebuilding effort and spent 2 weeks on it. When a Mexican family named Solis settled on land near Dolores Vegas and found themselves met with hostility from some quarters, Harriet had made a point of calling on them, bringing provisions, and telling anyone in town who cared to express an opinion that the Solis family were neighbors and would be treated as such. The injustice of the treatment of people on their own merited land, people who were regarded with suspicion and hostility for the simple fact of who they were and where they came from, was not something Harriet Conley Bailey was willing to treat as a matter of opinion. Dolores Vega had become, over the years, one of Harriet's closest friends, the kind of friend who could be called upon at any hour and who would arrive without needing to be briefed on the situation. She had also, in the fall of 1886, married a quiet and steady man named Abel Reyes who farmed land adjacent to hers, and who regarded Dolores with the specific quality of appreciation that comes from fully understanding what you have. And they had a daughter named Maria, who was 18 months younger than Clara Bailey, and who became Clara's most devoted companion. Henry Bailey, at age 6, had developed into a small person of considerable competence and absolutely no self-doubt, both of which his parents regarded with a mixture of pride and preemptive concern. He could already ride, though Calvin insisted on a patient and properly sized pony named Biscuit rather than any of the working horses. He had his mother's methodical intelligence and his father's patience, which was a combination that seemed likely to produce a formidable adult, and both his parents held this expectation with the quiet pride of people who understand that the best thing you can do for a child is help them become fully themselves. Clara, at 2, was still in the process of revealing herself, but what was revealed was a person who was observant, genuinely kind in the instinctive way of a child who has not yet learned to calculate kindness, and who had a gift for stillness that seemed to come from nowhere in particular, since neither of her parents were exactly still, but which sat on her naturally and beautifully. It was on a warm September afternoon in 1887, nearly 5 years after Calvin had first ridden into Caldwell on a cold October morning, with a string of horses and a hunger that would prove to be about more than whatever the hotel kitchen was serving, that Calvin and Harriet sat together on the south porch in the afternoon light, while Henry played in the paddock with Biscuit under Eli's patient supervision, and Clara slept inside. The land around them was in its autumn gold, the creek running with the particular clarity of September water, the sky beginning its October preparation, and the house behind them solid and warm and full of the ordinary, extraordinary evidence of a life being built together. Henry's boots by the door, Clara's small blanket on the bench, Harriet's current commission project folded on the table inside, Calvin's ledger for the horse business beside it, the jar of wildflowers on the windowsill that he still brought her, not from any deliberate romanticism, but because he still noticed them when he was riding out and still thought of her when he did. "I have been thinking," Harriet said. "Tell me," Calvin said. "About what I thought my life would be," she said, "when I was 22 and newly come to Kansas, full of the idea that things would build themselves according to the general shape I expected, and what it actually became, which is very different from what I expected and very much better." He was quiet beside her, listening. "I was thinking specifically," she said, "that the difference between what I feared when Thomas left and what I have now is larger than I have the vocabulary to accurately measure, that I came very close to deciding that the risk of this, of loving someone, of trying again, was not one I was capable of taking. What changed your mind?" He asked. She looked at him, and in 5 years of looking at him she had not run out of new things to find in his face. "You listened," she said simply. "You paid attention. You were where you said you would be. Those things are not small, they are in fact the entire thing." He reached over and covered her hand with his, and she turned her palm up to meet his, the gesture that had been there since Christmas Day 1882 across a table with a copy of Middlemarch between them. And they sat in the September afternoon, while the creek ran and Henry's laughter carried across the paddock, and the land around them held them in the enormous, indifferent, beautiful embrace of the Kansas plain. He had looked. He had ridden from Texas through Oklahoma through Kansas, over 13 years of a particular kind of searching, that he had not always had words for the searching of a man who knows that what he wants exists, but has not yet found where it lives. He had looked, and he had found her on a sidewalk with a bolt of calico slipping from her shoulder, and she was better than anything he had imagined, because she was actual, because she was real, because she was here, and because she had chosen with the same deliberate and hard-won courage that she brought to every other significant thing in her life, to let him stay. Nothing better existed because he had looked, and what he had found was not better, it was everything. The October of 1887 brought a letter from Calvin's sister Ruth in Texas, reporting that Ruth's husband James had been offered a teaching position in a school in a city, and that they were considering moving, and that Ruth was trying to collect Calvin's opinion on whether a city was a good place to raise children, which she appeared to be asking as a way of saying she was not sure she wanted to go. Calvin wrote her a long letter back, longer than his letters usually were, in which he said that a city might be a fine place to raise children, but that it depended on whether the city felt like home, and that he had found, through considerable trial, that home was less about geography than about the people you were with and the life you were building, and that when you found both of those things in a place, the place itself became necessary. Ruth wrote back to say she had read the letter twice, and then read it to James, and that James had said he thought his brother-in-law was a philosopher in disguise, and that they had decided to stay in Texas for the time being. Harriet read the letter exchanged and said nothing except that she thought Calvin had expressed himself well, which from Harriet was a considerable statement. The autumn moved on and the winter came, their fifth winter on the land south of Caldwell, and it was a gentler winter than some of the previous ones had been, or perhaps it simply felt gentler because they were fully settled in it now. The house was warm and tight, the horses were well sheltered, the root cellar was stocked with the summer's harvest from Harriet's garden, and the family had learned the particular rhythms of a plains winter, and had arranged their life around those rhythms with the confidence of people who are at home in their territory. Henry, who had begun attending the school in Caldwell that fall and was finding it simultaneously engaging and insufficient, conducted a relentless campaign for a dog, which his parents resisted for 3 weeks and then capitulated to, because the campaign was too well organized to remain defensible. The dog was a large and amiable mixed breed named Judge, the name being Henry's contribution, the reasoning for which he never adequately explained, who attached himself to Henry with the total devotion of a dog who has found his person, and who was welcomed by Clara with such wholehearted enthusiasm that Judge spent the first several days visibly bewildered by the scale of the affection being directed at him. In the spring of 1888, Harriet turned 32. Calvin organized a dinner that was in his understanding of such things modest, and in Harriet's experience of such things substantial. Dolers and Abel came, and the Harkers came, and Clara from the hotel came and cried at some point in the evening about nothing in particular, except that she appeared to find occasions of happiness genuinely overwhelming. It was a good evening, crowded and warm, the house full of people who had become the community of their life out here. The specific, chosen, real community that was different from the town's general community, the people who knew them not as social facts but as actual persons. After everyone had gone, the children asleep, the dishes managed, the lamp burning low, Harriet and Calvin sat at the table in the quiet of their own house, and she put her head on her hand and looked at him across the cleared table and said, "I have been thinking about a third child." He raised his eyebrows, not in surprise exactly, but in the specific attentiveness of a person being given information they are taking seriously. "That is a significant thought," he said. "It is," she agreed. "I am aware of that. I am also aware that I am 32 and that this is probably the appropriate time to be having the thought if I am going to have it." "How do you feel about it?" he asked. "I feel," she said carefully, that this house has room and that we have room and that Henry and Clara would either be greatly enriched by another sibling or would form a powerful alliance against it, and I think the odds are roughly even." He smiled, his smile that was slow and real, that did not come out for performances. "I feel the same way," he said. She reached across the table and took his hand in both of hers. "Good," she said. The third child, another boy, born in January of 1889, in the middle of a snowstorm that trapped Dr. Hatch at the house for 2 days afterward, which Dr. Hatch spent reading every book on Harriet's shelf that he had not already read. They named William, called Will. He was a round, placid, cheerful infant who seemed constitutionally uninterested in the difficulties that had attended his brother's early infancy, and who slept at reasonable hours and ate enthusiastically, and smiled at everyone with an openness that made all of them love him immediately and somewhat helplessly. Henry, who was 5, received Will with the measured dignity of a person who has decided to be magnanimous about a situation that was not requested. Clara, who was almost 2, received Will by attempting to share her blanket with him, which was her highest form of offering. Calvin Bailey, holding his third child in the kitchen of the house he had built on a creek that ran clear, with his wife sitting beside him and his other 2 children visible through the doorway, arranging Judge the dog into a position that Judge was tolerating with the patience of a saint, felt the world he had made around him with the completeness of a man who has built something that will outlast him and knows it. Outside, the January snow covered the Kansas plain in its enormous silence, and the creek ran slow and cold under its ice, and Caldwell was a light in the dark to the north, and the stars above the cloud cover were doing their perpetual work of mapping the sky, and everything that mattered in Calvin Bailey's world was inside this house, present and whole and entirely real. He had left nothing for something better. He had found nothing better. He had looked in 13 years of open country and moving on, in the patient and sometimes lonely searching of a man who knows what he wants but has not yet encountered it. And what he had found, in a town he had ridden into on an October morning with a string of horses and a hunger he could not quite name, was Harriet Conley, who had been left for something better by a man who had not understood what he had, and who had rebuilt herself from that leaving with such thoroughness and grace that, when Calvin arrived, she was entirely herself, complete and capable and beautifully real. And all he had to do was be honest and be present and be the kind of man who stays. And he stayed. On the south porch of the house along the creek, in all the seasons that followed, the springs with the prairie flowering in colors that were like something from a painting that had never been adequately painted, the summers thick with heat, and the smell of good grass and horse and soil, the autumns that turned the world to gold, the winters that pressed the world down into the clean, severe beauty of the plains at rest. Calvin and Harriet Bailey sat together in the evenings when the work was done, and the children were settled, and the day had given everything it had to give, and they watched the sky perform its constant and extraordinary show, and they were, in the deepest and most permanent sense of the word, home. The creek ran clear. The horses moved in their paddock in the long light. Henry grew into exactly the formidable person his parents had quietly anticipated, competent and principled, and capable of the kind of focused effort that turns intention into result. And Clara grew into the still, observant, deeply kind person she had begun to be, and Will grew into a person of such cheerful and genuine warmth that people could not seem to help being made better by his presence. And Thomas Wren rode off in some other direction toward something better, and found or did not find what he was looking for. And it did not matter, because the story that mattered was not his story. It was hers, and it was Calvin's, and it was the story of 2 people who had each in their own way been alone in the world and had found each other on a sidewalk in Caldwell, Kansas, in the October of 1882, and had chosen each other with the full knowledge of what choosing meant, and had never had occasion to choose otherwise, because what they had chosen was entirely sufficient and more than sufficient, was in fact extraordinary in the way that real things are extraordinary, not spectacular. Not legendary, but true and lasting and theirs. The sky above the Kansas plain was enormous and indifferent and absolutely beautiful. The creek ran on. The family endured and grew, and was, in all the ways that count toward a life being well lived, abundantly and permanently happy.